Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be talking about the new 35mm f1.4. In this video we'll be talking about the external design, the image quality of this lens, how it compares against the 35mm 1.8, and also what it's like when using it for video and for stills. First things first, let's get a couple of things out of the way. This 35mm f1.4 is not the 35mm S-line lens that is currently on the roadmap. The Nikon lens roadmap that's been around for a long time still has a 35mm S-line lens on that roadmap, technically that hasn't been released yet. So this lens is not it. This lens is not an S-line lens, which means it's different to the 35mm 1.8S. Traditionally, a lot of people might think that a 1.4 lens is better than a 1.8 lens. That's not necessarily true. And in this instance, the S designates that this is a better lens when it comes to coatings and when it comes to dealing with things like chromatic aberration, flaring, all those types of characteristics. Does that mean that the 1.8 is the better lens than the 1.4, or does it mean that the 1.4 is the better lens? That will really come down to your use case, and we'll talk about the image quality differences between the two because they are designed massively differently when it comes to their optical quality. One of them might look better in certain situations and one of them might look better in others, and we'll talk about that. But I do think there are reasons for both of these lenses, and that doesn't mean that you should go out and own both, but I think there are photographers that would prefer the look and the feel of the 1.4, and there are photographers that would prefer the look and the feel of the 1.8. So when it comes to the 35mm 1.4's external design, there is going to be a full metal mount at the base of the lens, and you also have then trims of plastic around the outside, followed by a metal part at the front of the lens. So that's the interesting part, is that with S-line lenses, they have a metal part at the bottom of the lens, whereas the front of the lens is plastic. Whereas with this lens, it's the exact opposite. We have plastic at the bottom and then a full metal trim at the front. Interesting design choice. It's also worth noting that the manual focusing dial of the 1.4 is a rubberized coated dial, whereas the 1.8S is a metal dial. So the materials are different between the two lenses, but they are extremely similar when it comes to their size. So the actual size of both lenses is almost identical. There's maybe 0.5 millimeter in it in certain measurements, but they are very, very similar in size. The f1.4 lens is heavier than the 1.8, but only marginally. And in terms of their lens hoods, they both use the same lens hood. And what I mean by that is that they are interchangeable. So you could both use the same lens hood. The lens hoods look identical, apart from having a slightly different material finish on them. But interestingly, they have different product codes. Now, the 1.4 does have the addition of technically having two dials. We have our autofocus and our manual focusing dial, and then we have also a function ring as well, which is customizable. So you can assign that ring to things like aperture, exposure, ISO. It's entirely up to you. That does make it an interesting lens to use with the ZF, because then from your ZF, you can control shutter speed, ISO on the top of the camera, and you can control aperture with the ring on the lens. So using this lens with my ZF has been really nice, especially because of how small and light it is. It's quite a nice lens with a really fast aperture to use on a ZF, so highly recommend this lens if you are a ZF owner already. There are no switches on the outside of this lens, so we don't get any control over autofocus, manual focus. There's no image stabilization or anything like that. All of that will be controlled in the camera. The 1.4 has a closest focusing distance of 27 centimeters, which is slightly further away than the 1.8. One other area that I think this 35mm 1.4 really shines is when you're using it with DX. So when you're using this lens on a Z30, a Z50 or a ZFC, this is a really nice lens. Not only do you get the middle portion of the lens, often the sharpest portion of the lens, but it also gives you a really nice 50mm focal length. So for those of you that are DX shooters and you wanted that really nice kind of fast, bright aperture 1.4 lens, this is a lens that's worth considering. I know that it's not a DX lens specifically, it being a 35mm full frame lens, but it works really nicely as a DX lens, and I have really enjoyed using this lens on my ZFC. So definitely something to consider for those of you that are DX shooters that want that better, brighter aperture f1.4. So overall, I think the design of this lens is quite nice. It's very subtle. There's nothing flashy about it. There's no gold rings. There's no silver rings. It's just a black tube. So there's nothing too special about it. But in terms of actually using it, it's actually been a really nice pleasure to use. The differences of having two different dials, one that I can have just as manual focus if I need it, and then one that I can customize, is actually really useful. And I would say that I prefer that over just the single dial of the 35 1.8. So definitely worth thinking about. Let's talk about optical quality. The 35mm 1.4 is a Nikon designed lens, but it is designed differently to the 1.8 series S-line lenses. So especially the 35mm and the 50mm 1.8 S-line lenses, they were specifically designed to be at their sharpest when wide open and a couple of stops after that. So they were designed to be at their optical best at 1.8, f2, f2.8 and f4. And then what you'd often find is that they would reduce some of that sharpness as you stop them down. However, the 35mm 1.4 is designed differently. It's designed to not give you its optimal sharpness when wide open at 1.4, and in fact it will give you its optimal sharpness when you stop the lens down. Also, not being an S-line lens means that it doesn't have all the same coatings, but the question is does that matter? When Nikon released their 1.8 range of lenses, there was quite a bit of confusion because everyone was like, oh, well, 1.8 isn't as good as 1.4 and the older lenses were 1.4 and all those types of things. But then as people used the 1.8s, they realized how good they were optically in terms of sharpness and just all-round image quality. And that then also raised a couple of concerns around how the 1.8 lenses were too clinical. Maybe they looked too optically perfect. And I guess with photographers, you can never make every photographer happy. So it was quite clear that with the 1.8 range of lenses, that there was a range of photographers that really liked them because they were clinical, they were sharp, they were perfect optically almost. But there was a creative set of photographers. There were a set of photographers that wanted a lens for its character, that wanted a lens for its softness, that wanted for a lens for its imperfections. And I think that this is where this 35mm 1.4 lens really shines. Just like the 28mm 2.8, the 40mm f2, those non-S-line lenses really tend to be way more characterful because there might be light flaring in a different way, or there might be a highlight that starts to get chromatic aberration on it in some way. And so it probably comes down to you as to which style of lens or what character of lens you want. And that also means that when it comes to video, I'd probably suspect that most of today's videographers who prefer that kind of characterful look and they want to put older generation lenses on the front of video cameras, they're probably going to prefer the 35mm 1.4. I personally prefer the look of this 1.4 over the 1.8, despite it not being as sharp. But sharpness isn't always everything. So this 35mm 1.4 I think looks really nice, especially when it comes to its depth of field. When it comes to its fall off, this works really nice, much better than the 1.8. Whereas the bokeh on the 1.8 can be very busy, this is much more rounded and much more controlled, and it does look a lot more like the Plena, the 135, than the 1.8 lens does. Because when you compare the bokeh of both of these lenses, there is quite significant a difference between the two. All right, first up, we have the 1.4 on the left and we have the 1.8S on the right. And as we said, the 1.8 is going to be the sharper lens when wide open, which makes sense, and we can see that here. It's not a massive difference. Whether this would be noticeable in real world examples, I'm unsure, but for those of you that are really looking for every single detail, the 1.8S is the sharper lens when wide open. Stopping both lenses down to f2.8 does sharpen up the 1.4, and it does get closer to the level of sharpness of the 1.8. I do think it is still slightly lagging behind, but I would say that at f2.8 they are much closer. Now, when you stop both the lenses down to f4, they are pretty much identical. The 1.4 lens really sharpens up and really catches up to the 1.8S. So if you are using that 1.4 lens wide open and stopped down, you will see it get a lot sharper when you stop that lens down to around about f4 and beyond, and it really matches the 1.8S. In this example, I just wanted to show you how easy it was to see the chromatic aberration. When this 1.4 lens is wide open at 1.4, you do get quite a bit of green and purple fringing, and this is a really easy example to look at here. When comparing the bokeh of both of these lenses, the 1.4 is going to be much better. There are much clearer, rounder bokeh balls compared to the 1.8S. They're much more defined, and it doesn't look as busy as the 1.8S does, and the transition is really nice and soft as we saw in some of the example images. So I think for those of you that are really looking for that soft, blurry background, that kind of portrait ethereal style look, then maybe the 1.4 is the lens that you would be most interested in over the 1.8. I also just wanted to highlight as well that in the real world, the level of sharpness and detail that you get out of this lens, even when shot at 1.4, is still really nice, and that level of chromatic aberration isn't really that noticeable. If we take this shot of the puffin here that's backlit with that bright background behind, the puffin is incredibly sharp when we crop in. We still get good detail in the feathers. Sure, the 1.8S would be sharper, but then I'm not able to shoot at 1.4, and the background blur doesn't look as nice. There's all these different variables, but actually using it in the real world, the 1.4 is still sharp enough, I think, and it would only be those of you that are really keen on sharpness and detail that would feel like they would need to go to the 35mm 1.8S. This is just a short example to show you focus breathing of the 35mm f1.4. Focus breathing is there, but it is minimal, it's not drastic, and it's pretty much in line with the focus breathing that we saw in the f1.8S. When it comes to focusing speed, we're looking at the 1.4 lens first, and there's no noticeable difference in focusing speed between the two. I've watched both of these examples back and I can't quite see a speed difference. They seem to be very similar in terms of focusing speed, at least when you're using the lenses out in the real world. One lens isn't going to focus faster than the other lens. You would feel like they focus just as fast as each other. So happy to say that they appear to focus as fast as each other. Overall, I think the 35mm f1.4 is a really nice lens. It's a lens that I've really enjoyed using, and the only thing I don't like about it is that it's a 35. I openly don't like the 35mm focal length. Please, can we have this style of lens in a 28mm 1.4 that would be able to match the legendary 28mm f1.4 f-mount lens? I love that lens, so please give me this style of lens in a 28mm. I would absolutely love that. But for those of you that do love the 35, I think you will really like this lens. Just keep in mind, it's all about what the lens looks like in terms of its depth of field fall off, and what the lens looks like when you're shooting it wide open, when it's getting reflections. It is just a really nice lens to use, especially when being used on something like a ZF. And it's just going to come down to your style of the difference between these two. I don't think that there's a case of one lens being better than the other when it comes to these lenses. I genuinely think it's all about choice and choosing the lens that's right for you and your style of shooting. Sharp, clinical, clean, characterful, lots of reflections, bit of ghosting, chromatic aberrations, but that might be what you want. That might be what you really want from this lens, but it still gives you all the extra benefits of really fast focusing in stills and video, and then the benefit of being able to shoot at f1.4 to let that little bit of extra light in. So there's no right or wrong between these, unfortunately. It just comes down to what you think you would prefer. All right, well, I hope that you found this video useful, and if you have any questions about the 35mm 1.4, please do let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.